Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining me in the video today. I'm really excited to show you a very rare and unique musical instrument. This is a bass clarinet, but it's not just any ordinary bass clarinet. Now, just looking at it, you won't really notice anything too unusual about it. So it's an instrument made by Buffet in around the 1920s, and maybe the only unusual feature you might notice is that it's got two manual register keys instead of just a single register key that operates two bends. So a bit unusual by modern standards, but fairly typical for the era. So at first glance, nothing really looks unusual about this instrument. That is until you compare it to another bass clarinet. So here you can see the upper joint of a normal B-flat bass clarinet in the middle, an instrument made by Buffet in the first half of the 20th century, just like this instrument. Above it's my C bass clarinet, and below it is this mystery instrument. So you can see it's quite a bit longer than a traditional Buffet B-flat bass clarinet. And in fact, the same is true of the lower joint. Even ignoring the extension that was added later, the tone hole spacing is quite a bit more in this instrument. So this instrument overall is quite a bit more stretched out and longer than a standard bass clarinet. And that's because this is a bass clarinet in the key of A. Now I know what you're probably thinking. How did I get my hands on a bass clarinet in the key of A? Aren't these things like extremely rare, and aren't there only a few of them in the hands of either collectors or museums or top professionals who pay top dollar for them? Well, while this is somewhat true, I was surprised to find that there's quite a few of these instruments floating around. If you've read Keith Bowen's paper, The Rise and Fall of the Bass Clarinet in A, he talks about a few of these instruments that are documented in museums. And from that paper, you can gather that there are probably about 20 or so instruments floating around that are known about. However, after doing my own research, I was actually surprised to find that there's quite a few more of these instruments than we may have thought. So the only other example of a Buffet bass clarinet that I could find pictures of was an instrument that was donated to the University of Edinburgh as part of the Nicholas Shackleton collection. And comparing this bass clarinet to my instrument, they look almost identical. So you can tell that they were made roughly in the same era. Now, in addition to this instrument, I was also reached out to by somebody who has another Buffet bass clarinet in the key of A from this era. And while I don't have direct evidence for it, I do remember a few years ago seeing a listing on eBay for a Buffet bass clarinet in the key of A, again from the first half of the 20th century. So it seems there are quite a few of these instruments floating around. Now, Jason Alder also pointed out to me that the 1922 Selmer catalog shows that you can get a bass clarinet not only in the key of A and B flat, but also in the key of C. And the cool thing is they were all the same price. So theoretically, if somebody had the means to purchase a B flat bass clarinet, which we know many people did, as we do see these instruments pop up in the used market, they would have had the means to purchase an A bass clarinet. So this suggests that not only were bass clarinets in A more common than we may have thought, but they were also generally available to the public, so it's not unreasonable that an instrument like this would show up. So before I talk about how I got this instrument, which is a really interesting story, I kind of want to talk about the instrument itself. So much like the relationship the A clarinet has to the B-flat soprano clarinet, the A bass clarinet has the B-flat bass clarinet. So similar tone hole sizes, similar key work, just a bit more stretched out. And surprisingly, the bore is actually a bit smaller than your standard B-flat bass clarinet, just like how the bore of an A clarinet is a bit smaller than a B-flat clarinet, which is a bit counterintuitive, but it actually helps a little bit with finger spacing. So normal bass clarinet is about 23.4, 23.5. This one's only 23.2. So a little bit smaller, but it really does make a bit of a difference in the tone. I'm actually really surprised by the tonal difference of this instrument to a B-flat bass clarinet. Other than that, it's pretty much built like a standard bass clarinet. Like I mentioned in my C bass clarinet video, a lot of the key arms, pad cups, touch pieces, stuff like that are the same as a B-flat bass clarinet, but in this case the rods and the linkages are lengthened to accommodate for the extra stretch of the instrument. Now, how I first got this instrument is a bit of a funny story. So if you know me, you know that I tend to buy a lot of instruments on eBay, specifically instruments made by Buffet and specifically low clarinets. So I've come across quite a few bass clarinets made by Buffet in my time. And this was just an instrument that I happened to buy just because it had a few parts and accessories that I wanted. I really wasn't interested in the instrument itself, and I got it for a fairly reasonable price. I paid about $1,300 for the instrument, and it came actually with a low C extension, a removable one that I'm planning on selling another instrument, which was well worth the $1,300 on its own. So I'll probably do something with that at some point. But then I had this instrument I had to deal with. So my first plan was basically to just fix it up so it was playing in okay condition and just kind of sell it as is as a nice cheap starter bass clarinet that somebody might want to use if they can't afford a nicer instrument. So I actually listed it for a little bit, and I was getting ready to keep lowering the price to try and get it to sell faster. And I decided to try playing it a little bit, and I noticed there were some really big problems with the instrument. So in addition to just the general condition of the instrument, I noticed that the intonation was just absolutely terrible. Specifically, I noticed that the throat tones were extremely sharp. In the case of the throat B flat, it was well over a quarter tone sharp. And on the other end of the instrument, I noticed that the lowest notes, both in the lower clarinet register and the lower chalumeau register, were extremely flat. Again, the low E was almost a quarter tone flat. So clearly this was a really big problem. This is some really serious intonation problems, and this instrument was essentially unusable in a modern ensemble. So the question is, why was this instrument having such problems? So after doing some investigating, I noticed that there were signs that the instrument had a few modifications done to it over years. So the biggest thing was that the tone holes, a few of them looked like they were enlarged, but it doesn't look like they were done very neatly. It looks like somebody took a Dremel or some kind of rotary tool like that and used it to roughly cut out the tone holes to a larger size. In fact, many of the tone holes were very ovalized, which really couldn't be done with the kind of reamers that a normal manufacturer would use for tone holes. And one of the tone holes even was actually bigger than the bore itself. So they actually cut out so much material that it went, the tone hole diameter was larger than the bore diameter, which obviously is not correct. So clearly somebody had done some modifications to this instrument. However, this really didn't explain the problems, because for the lower notes to be flat, that would mean you had to have added material. And there really wasn't any evidence of this same enlarging of tone holes on the upper end of the upper joint where the throat tones would come from. So that didn't really answer the question. It wasn't until I looked at the neck that I realized that it almost looked like the neck was cut down, suggesting this instrument was supposed to be a lot lower pitched than it currently is. So that got me to experiment a bit. So what I did was I kind of made this little 3D printed extension that I put in the neck to make it about 30 millimeters longer. And I tried putting a little bit of tape on some of the tone holes that looked like they were enlarged. And I was surprised to find that this bass clarinet actually played a pretty reasonable scale, only the instrument was now tuned in the key of A. So this was really fascinating. So again, if you read Keith Bowen's paper, he does mention that some instruments that might have been pitched in the key of A before the change from high pitch to low pitch could have been theoretically retuned to B flat. However, this instrument, it appears that it was originally a low pitch instrument. In fact, it's marked low pitch in the key of A that was modified to play in the key of B flat, which is just kind of baffling. I mean, why would somebody try and modify such a rare and theoretically very valuable instrument? And I think a lot of that has to do with the way the bass clarinet in A was viewed at the time. So this is a time when the bass clarinet was seen as more of an obsolete instrument that had no use. So I don't think it's really out of the realm of possibility that somebody had this useless bass clarinet that they couldn't really use sitting around. So maybe they tried to make it play like in the same key as a modern bass clarinet, which I think definitely is not out of the realm of possibility. So that appears to be what happened to this instrument, at least based off the evidence that I found. So then the question is, what do I do with this instrument now? Well, so I have a bass clarinet that's theoretically an instrument in A, but one that's completely out of tune, that's somebody really completely messed up, and it's essentially just spare parts at this point. The only way to really fix it would be an extensive restoration project. So that's exactly what I did. So the first thing I did was lengthen the neck so that it would be the correct length. So I kind of used the pictures of the instrument from the Shackleton collection as a reference, and also I kind of did some tests to figure out how long exactly I would need to make it. So what did I ended up doing? Originally I was thinking about just brazing just another piece of a bass clarinet neck on to bring it to the correct length. But what instead I did was I added this tuning slide, sort of like the tuning slides you would see on a 1980s Buffet RC Prestige bass clarinet. So it gives you a little bit of tuning, which in addition to not having to permanently modify the neck by brazing it, allows me to tune it. It's much more practical, and it keeps the parts as I originally see them intact. So the next thing was the tone holes. So obviously if somebody went at the tone holes with a Dremel, there's going to be a significant amount of damage there. So somehow it needs to be repaired. And this was probably the longest part of the project for me. So after thinking about it for quite a bit, what I did was I made some bushings out of either brass for some of the smaller tone holes or hard rubber for some of the larger tone holes, and I glued them in there with super glue. And that may sound like a bit of an extreme modification, but the idea with that is that if I somehow messed up and I wanted to remove them, all I had to do was put a little bit of acetone on them and I could go back to where I was. So the idea was to not permanently modify the instrument from the state it was currently in, just in case the modifications I was doing was incorrect. So after that, and after giving it a full overhaul with music medic pads and all hand-cut keycorks, I now have a playing bass clarinet in the key of A. So when I received the instrument, it actually had an extension on it to go to low E flat. Actually, the original instrument would have gone to low E, just like the other Buffet bass clarinets that I previously mentioned. But this instrument was previously extended to E flat. The only problem was they made the extension out of a section of a bass clarinet joint. So just like they essentially cut off the last few inches of a B flat bass clarinet joint and grafted it onto the lower joint of this instrument permanently. Now the problem with that, because you're taking a section from a B flat bass and putting it on an A bass, it wasn't long enough. So I also had to make this short Delrin section that fits between the lower joint and the bell, and it's permanently held on with a clamp. And then I had to modify the key accordingly, and that brings the B and the low E and the low E flat, which is a concert C sharp, more into tune. Now, I actually had to make the extension, the Delrin extension, quite a bit longer than it normally would need to be. And that's because a lot of these older bass clarinets, they're tuned to favor the lower register. So what that means is they'll favor the low E being in tune and make the clarion B sharp. Now this is different than what we do in modern times. In modern times, we generally favor the clarion B because it is a more important note, and we leave the E flat. So that's kind of what I did. So I made it a little bit longer just to make that clarion B dead on in tune. And now the low E is flat as a consequence, but that's pretty typical as far as bass clarinets go. So I'm not too worried about that. So after all that work, after months of careful restoration, I now have a playing bass clarinet in the key of A. I also had a theory that this instrument might be tuned to a bit lower than 440. For example, 435 was very common in the 19th century. However, I pulled the neck out all the way, and while the notes around the center of the instrument tuned to 435, I still had the same problems where the upper notes were very sharp and the lower notes were very flat. I actually got a chance to compare it to an instrument made by Buffet from the 1890s, which theoretically would be more likely to be tuned to 435, and this instrument was still a lot shorter than this bass clarinet that I got, and it played in tune without the same intonation problems. So clearly there was something else going on. So after hearing about all those modifications I had to do to bring the instrument back to what I believe is the original state, you're probably asking, well, how does the instrument play and how does it sound? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a chromatic scale from low E flat up to high C, and I'm going to have a tuner here so you can see the intonation. I'm not going to be looking at the tuner, I'm just going to be playing it without any adjustments, just how the instrument naturally sits. few small problems such as the flat low E and the stuffy C sharp, I would say overall it plays quite well. Now it's worth noting that a lot of bass clarinets from this vintage don't have perfect intonation, and they do tend to have a few stuffy notes here and there. Overall, I'd say this played fairly well compared to other bass clarinets from the era. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video discussing this very rare and unusual instrument. If you have any question about this instrument, please let me know in the comments. Alright everyone, I hope you all have a wonderful day.